Well, thank you, Don. I don't know about the intimidating men thing, but certainly it's been an interesting road, definitely, over the years. And the title of my remarks, I don't know if you noticed, but it's why Eastern Canada needs to smarten up and support the West. And I'm located in the Toronto area, so I've understood some of you have said you won't hold that against me, and I do appreciate that. But it's great to be able to speak to this group. Catherine Brownlee and I have had a number of collaborations over the last little while, and I thank her. I think she's just left, so I'd like to thank her for helping to organize this here tonight, because I had a trip planned out to Alberta to a few locations, and I try to get out to Alberta at least once a year if I can, ideally more, because I've always felt a real kinship. I find you have such an entrepreneurial, wonderful entrepreneurial culture out here, probably the most entrepreneurial in Canada, I would say. And also to meet with business owners, see what their issues are. I had a few meetings with media, because our media is really in a weird state right now, as I'm sure you're aware, where the Trudeau government is basically bribing them, and they're very happy to take that money, because their industry is very much affected by technological change, just like pretty much every other industry. So we, the taxpayer, end up pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into bribing journalists to give the Trudeau government positive coverage, and it's a real shame, because the media should, of course, be objective. They can be a very useful tool for all of us to understand what's going on and so on, but these days, unfortunately, they're not. So it's a very strange time. I've done a lot of traveling across Canada, as well as elsewhere, but you know, it's interesting that Quebec likes to think that it has a distinct society. But when you travel across Canada, you realize that there's actually many, many distinct societies in this country, and I've even heard it said that politics kind of has a different character depending on what part of Canada you're in. And in the Atlantic region, politics is almost like a way of life. In Quebec, it's kind of like a religion. In Ontario, it's quite businesslike, and on the prairies, it's grassroots, and in British Columbia, it's entertainment. Now, I know that you recently had Danielle Smith here to speak with you, and something probably most of you aren't aware of is that a number of years ago, I was Danielle's boss. When I was president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Danielle joined us for a few years to be the Director of Provincial Affairs for Alberta. So I got to know Danielle very well and was very happy to see her elected as Premier. I can't think of, in the current circumstances, I really can't think of anyone better to guide Alberta through the challenging times right now, with strength and intelligence and no fear to stand up to the federal bullies. I retired from CFIB. I'd been there almost 30 years at the time, and I retired a few years ago, but I failed very miserably at retirement, and someone asked me to come and head up an upstart business organization called the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. And I brought some magazines, just they're scattered around the tables, just to give you a bit of an example of some of the stuff we do. Obviously, our goals are very similar to most small, medium-sized business groups out there. We are predominantly manufacturers, but not exclusively. And we do a monthly, among many, many other things, we do a monthly online magazine, but we often do print out a few copies just so people can have a look at it and so on. But if you're interested in receiving the magazine monthly, please, you can just go to our website, ccmbc.ca. It's free, and you can receive those magazines electronically. In Canada, there's an old saying that if you want to have a small business, you just have to buy a big business and wait a while. But that's actually not true. We do have much more of an entrepreneurial culture than I think a lot of Canadians really understand, and it isn't recognized as much as it should be. But it certainly has had more truth, unfortunately, over the last number of years under the Trudeau government. And our first clue was very early in his time as the Liberal leader. He foolishly said that small business owners were tax cheats. You may remember that he had so little understanding of the reality of the small, medium-sized business sector that he made that ridiculous remark. And no one who was thoughtful would ever say that about a sector that in Canada represents about half of our gross domestic product and over half of new job creation in any given year. Since then, of course, we've seen a lot more bloopers from Trudeau, like she experienced it differently. I have much admiration for China's basic dictatorship. Budgets balance themselves. You'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy, and so on. I could go on, but I think we've got better things to talk about than Trudeau's bozo eruptions. As someone I'm based in Ontario, as I mentioned earlier, and I've always believed that Alberta, and even to some degree Saskatchewan as well, have been greatly undervalued by Eastern Canada. And that's why I wanted to address this topic here tonight. So few Eastern Canadians understand the enormous role that Alberta plays in our national economy. And just in terms of dollars alone, you're probably aware that Alberta has contributed over $600 billion to the rest of Canada in one way or another. And this amounts to about $3,300 per person, per Alberta resident, annually. So that's a good chunk of change. The recent debates we've seen around establishing an Alberta pension plan to replace the Canadian pension plan have also showed how Alberta contributes a disproportionate amount of CPP premiums, and they do come out at just over 50% of the assets of the Canadian pension plan. And this is partly a function of the fact that Alberta has a younger population, so not as many retired people relative to the younger people that are paying into the plan, and also higher incomes than other parts of Canada. But things like the very complicated and imbalanced way in which things like equalization payments, the way they're computed, is not unfavorable to Alberta. But a lot of governments and Canadians don't either realize or account for the fact that Alberta consistently punches above its weight. And the current government in Ottawa is certainly a classic example of this, punishing the vital oil and gas sector, continuing this equalization formula, which does discriminate against certain parts of the country, but has been in place for years. But they didn't consult any of the provinces on the last change they made to the equalization formula, and it's many, many billions of dollars involved there as well. Of course, it might be genetic, given that the last time we had such a terrible government, it was also headed by a Trudeau. So there's something about Trudeaus in Alberta that just don't compute. I've certainly been appalled, actually, over the years at how a majority of Ontarians don't appreciate the massive and positive impact that Alberta has upon their own economic prospects. And when the Trudeau government does something that is disproportionately harmful to Alberta, as it's done many times, as you well know, most Ontarians seem to have the attitude, oh, well, that's too bad for Alberta, but hey, it doesn't affect me. But nothing could be further from the truth. For starters, many, many businesses in Ontario are linked with Alberta businesses in one way or another and are dependent upon their success. In the coalition that I'm working with now, many of our members have very productive relationships with Alberta businesses to each of their advantages. And as a result, many jobs in Ontario are also very dependent upon the success of Alberta's economy. And of course, there are those statistics that show how Alberta's contribution funds so many Canadian social programs, things like CPP and employment insurance as well as equalization payments to the rest of Canada. I think it's pretty ironic too. In the federal budget earlier this year, we saw Chrystia Freeland quite pleased that they had higher revenues than they expected to have, and yet the sole reason they had higher revenues was because of the success of the oil and gas sector. So the sector they're trying to kill meant that their budget looked better than it otherwise would have. Still didn't look very good, but it did look better than it otherwise would have. Alberta, of course, currently under Danielle Smith's leadership, is leading the country in promoting policies that are good for all Canadians, notably regarding a lot of the punitive federal policies toward the oil and gas sector under the rubric of the net zero agenda. I've heard people say that net zero is really the amount of brain cells that Stephen Guilbeault has at any given time. The good news is that the net zero dominoes are starting to fall, and this is very good news, not just for the oil and gas sector, but for all of us. For years, Canadians and the citizens of other countries have been sold such fictions as that the climate is in crisis, needs urgent action, and that policies geared to achieving net zero carbon emissions won't be difficult and will lead to the creation of so many well-paying green jobs that we won't even notice the added taxes that we'll have to pay to supposedly reduce emissions. We were told the economy and the environment go hand in hand and that climate policies will boost economic growth and our standard of living. We were also told the carbon tax would pay Canadians back more money than they actually would pay in tax. And I remember former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Walls saying that the only previous time he had been offered a deal like that was from a Nigerian prince. We were also told that the transition to net zero would be virtually painless for lower and middle class Canadians, was absolutely necessary to prevent the boiling of our planet, and we were told that renewable energy sources such as wind and solar could easily replace fossil fuels with no one really noticing any change. We've also been sold a bill of goods on electric vehicles, which we've been told would easily replace internal combustion engine vehicles, be much cleaner and cheaper in the long run. So now that we've had a few years of experience with these policies, we've seen that all of these promises and claims were lies. The house of cards is collapsing as people realize that fossil fuels have not been a scourge on humanity at all, but rather the key reason why our standards of living are as high as they are and why developing countries are doing better every year and global poverty is declining. It's a foolish arrogance on the part of governments and the environmental groups, which of course are funded by governments, so they're really kind of like an arm of government, to think that tweaking a few of our policies can affect the climate. Many learned scientists who originally bought into the climate crisis have totally reversed their views now, and they realize that this whole movement was political, not based on facts or science. Canadians and others around the world have seen their standard of living decline as various fossil fuels essential to their existence become much more costly and often less available, as Europe has found as it tried to switch over to so-called renewable sources. And then, and then the conflict in Russia changed the equation quite substantially. We've also seen that the wind, solar, and biofuel replacements for fossil fuels lead to blackouts and system unreliability while costs soar for consumers and businesses. Electric vehicles have been shown, I have some water, that's good, thank you. Electric vehicles have been shown to be much less environmentally friendly than we were first told, much more expensive than the internal combustion vehicles, and with their very heavy batteries, they make auto accidents much more deadly, and they put much more wear and tear on our roads and other infrastructure. All of those promised high-paying green jobs have failed to materialize. And other countries, I'm sure you've read in the news, other countries and auto manufacturers are backing off their investments in EVs, electric vehicles, but yet Canadian governments have, in just the last number of months, spent a massive $50 billion of our money on subsidies for profitable foreign auto companies to build EV batteries. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest disasters we've ever seen in terms of corporate welfare and business subsidies. I think that the EV industry is on the decline, and that these factories are likely to be mothballed in the not too distant future as consumers reject electric vehicles as their downsides become much more obvious. And I know a number of people have talked about Bill C-69 and the recent court decisions that we've seen, which for a change have been very encouraging and have also acknowledged the many problems with the Liberals' climate legislation. Of course, the so-called the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, also known as the No More Pipelines Bill, was declared as unconstitutional, as it surely was. This was a huge victory, needless to say, for Alberta and Saskatchewan, and a big stick in the eye for Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault and the rest of the Trudeau Liberals. More recently, a federal court, it's not the Supreme Court yet, but a federal court rejected Guilbeault's plastic ban, finding it unscientific, unreasonable, and unconstitutional. Guilbeault has developed a reputation of being very inflexible, incapable of considering others' points of view, and has made a habit of intruding upon provincial jurisdiction. Another initiative that's underway right now is the so-called electrification plan of the federal government. And one of the magazines that we distributed earlier, actually the subject of it is the whole electrification issue, which basically means that all of our electricity should be generated by renewable energy sources, which is an absolute impossibility, and the cost absolutely stunning. So that is also, mind you, one that seriously invades provincial jurisdiction. And I know Danielle has made has discussed this quite a bit. So I think, given that we've seen 2 court decisions now that have ruled these kinds of policies are intruding upon provincial jurisdiction and often also don't have very good science basis, I think this will probably meet the same fate, and it will be strike 3 for Guilbeault. As, of course, the so-called COP28 conference is going on in Dubai right now, with apparently potentially as many as 100,000 participants, many, of course, arriving in the United Arab Emirates by private jet. And at this particular COP meeting, there are more net zero opponents attending than has ever before been the case. And of course, Danielle, we were chatting just a couple of weeks ago, and her comment was that she was going to COP because she wasn't going to let Guilbeault tell the Alberta story. We've also seen many more oil and gas executives going to this particular meeting than have gone previously, so they can tell their story as well. We also saw, you might have seen that the Sultan in the UAE, who is chairing this conference, made the statement that we can only move away from fossil fuels if we plan to go back to living in caves. So there's the guy heading it that's must have really pleased a lot of the attendees, I suspect, when he made that comment. So these meetings are usually horribly boring, bureaucratic, and of course very expensive on taxpayers who are usually funding most of it. But with all the controversy going on this year, I think it's actually one of the more entertaining ones that we've seen in quite some time. And of course, the massive number of environmental groups there, sent by tax dollars as well, are lobbying to deny in future people like Danielle and the oil and gas executives from being able to attend these conferences in the future. Of course, the real pièce de résistance we saw in Canada was that temporary removal of the carbon tax on home heating oil, which of course was directed at Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals have lost many, many votes recently. After years of insisting that the carbon tax had to be universal, there could be no exemptions, everyone in Canada had to pay it, and that most people got more money back than they paid in, so hey, it shouldn't be a problem. They made this exemption, which merely showed that they were lying all along and their so-called lofty climate principles could be totally abandoned if some votes were at stake. It's also totally undermined Trudeau's whole carbon tax regime. Another potentially massive negative policy, of course, is the one that was just announced today, which was the cap on emissions. And this has been... We've known they were going to make something public for a while, but Guilbeault decided he would announce it at the COP28 meeting. And both Danielle Smith and a number of industry analysts and others have stated that the implementation of an emissions cap will effectively mean a production reduction for Alberta. And I know that Danielle has said she will ignore it, basically. And I believe it's also another one of these jurisdictional issues that the courts will decide it's not in the federal authority to do that. The other irony, of course, is that Trudeau made that lovely statement that there was no business case for exports of LNG, where many other countries seem to be doing just fine doing that, but not Canada. And it's so perverse because of course you're damaging the environment. You could replace coal and other dirtier sources of energy by clean LNG, and yet this so-called environmentally, concerned government doesn't want to go there. So it does come down to it's punishing Alberta. You really have to wonder if we had oil sands in Quebec, what the policies would look like. There are also other economic sectors whose emissions are similar to that of oil and gas. The whole notion of buildings, the two top emission sectors are oil and gas and buildings. They're almost comparable, and yet no such imposition of caps are being imposed on other sectors. So it's clearly very selective, and it's not a consistent policy at all. The next couple of years, if the Liberals manage to stay in power, will be very interesting, with the caveat that the old Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times," was intended as a curse. The organization I'm with, the CCMBC, has been an outspoken voice opposing the net zero agenda right from the get-go. And too many people in industries were going along with the government. I mean, when I saw CEOs of large energy companies when the NDP were in power here, standing up on a podium with Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau. It's like, why don't you just slit your wrist right now? Because they're just going against the interests of their own industries. It's utterly ridiculous. But again, big corporations, unlike the small, medium-sized business sector, big corporations tend to go along to get along with governments and so on, no matter who's in power and no matter how bad their policies may be. My philosophy, I've been an advocate for small, medium-sized business for over 40 years now, and my philosophy has always been that if you're nice to the cannibals, they might eat you last. Appeasing bullies never works and never will. Trillions of dollars worldwide have been spent on this net zero folly to date, and tens of billions in Canada to pursue an impossible and unnecessary climate fantasy. And although it's very refreshing to finally see the facts and the courts counter the ridiculous policies the Trudeau government has been espousing for its entire 8 years in office, I'm sure we can all think of much better ways to have spent those billions of dollars that have been wasted and continue to be wasted by Liberals. This is why I put a focus in Ontario on putting out more information, better information, so that Ontarians can understand how much Alberta matters to them, and that it's not just a faraway issue that doesn't have an impact on them. Same for Quebec, because the two biggest provinces influence a lot of votes, as we know, and they need to, Quebec equalization payments alone are going to be close to $20 billion this year. That's a big chunk of the Quebec provincial budget, and most of that's coming from this province. We're doing everything we can to get the word out, and I know that the Alberta Enterprise Group with Catherine is also doing the same thing, and I think all of our voices are needed out there. The only solution to our present challenges with a very problematic government in Ottawa is to get rid of them, and more awareness of Alberta's key role can help to swing those important votes in Eastern Canada to accomplish that end. Thank you.